Good evening, everyone. How's everybody doing tonight? Good? So far, so good. Hi, my name is Mike Ramanashai. I'm a board member of the FCCT, and I'm also a technology reporter for Voice TV, a local Thai TV station. So tonight, I will be moderating a very, very interesting panel discussions that also, I've been following these topics for almost a half decades, and it's a topic that's very interesting in this time. Is about the startups and the tech startups in Thailand. So I'm pretty sure that all of you here are familiar with what startups is, and and about the tech industry in general. You probably, since everybody have the smartphones, you probably have download some apps that runs by startups, obviously, apps like Uber or Grab or Indigo, for example. That's what Michael is the co-founder of Indigo or TripAdvisor or these kind of apps. So, but you probably haven't seen these kind of services or products from Thai tech startups, or you might have seen it, but you haven't seen them growing in the big scales, in the global scales, like these startups that I mentioned. So so let's talk about it. So how what's happening in the Thai startup industry? What is Thai startup communities doing right now? So I'm just gonna introduce you to our speakers real quick, and I'll let our first speaker speak. So at first we have correct me if I'm wrong, if I spelled your name, if I pronounce your name wrong. Bart Medici?
Correct.
All right. So Bart is from the Bangkok Entrepreneurs. He's he's been familiar with the startups, the startup scenes for a little bit. And then we have David Shelters. David Shelter is he's entrepreneurs and startups, and he's been also familiar with this industry for quite a bit. I know before this, we've been talking a lot about about the investments and the difference of investments of Thai startups is having. And last but not least, we have Michael Gruzel. Okay? So he's the co-founder and the group CEO of Indigo. So Indigo is a mobile app. Tell me if I'm wrong. So it's an app about you search the local restaurants, and you get the the reviews, the restaurant reviews and recommendations for the restaurants, and it's available. How many countries that is available right now, Michael?
6 countries.
Yeah. And it's also widely available in Thailand. It's also one of the apps that I enjoy using, especially because I'm a foodie person. So I happen to use Indigo a lot. So but first, let's start with Bart. So he's gonna give you a brief introductions about the Thai startup communities. Bart, off you go.
Yeah. Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Mike, for inviting us and for organizing this panel. So I didn't know exactly who would be the audience, so we're going to talk about a lot of things related to the Thailand startup scene. Maybe I'm going to go quite quickly on some slides just to give some ideas and to encourage the discussion and the questions later on, because depending on who you are, you may know or not some stuff already about this Thailand startup scene, right? But before I start, let me introduce myself very quickly. I've been in Thailand since late 2006. Tech entrepreneur, right? Digital advertising and startups and tech, and also consultant, and organizing networking events since 2012. Organizing events with Bangkok Entrepreneurs, which is my company. So our ambition is to actually connect business people in Thailand, but also create quality content through talks, through conference, through event, and contribute to create a vibrant tech community by allowing people to exchange experience and idea and to connect with other people in the country and to people in the region. So we organize several events, monthly networking events, but also tech conferences and workshops. Before we talk about Thailand, I have an interesting slide about the best startups ecosystem in the world, right? Unfortunately, Thailand is not there yet, and that's something we can discuss later on. These are the best, the 20 best startup ecosystem according to the Global Startup Ecosystem Report. This is 2017. Singapore is there. As you can see, Singapore is making the cut at the 12th rank. And what's very important is that for the first time, so the first one, right, are Silicon Valley, New York, London, the usual suspects, right? But for the first time, Singapore is beating everyone with talent. They're the startup ecosystem that attracting the most talent in the world. And that's very interesting. Yet, they are losing 2 ranks compared to the last rank that was in 2015. And why are they losing 2 ranks? Actually, you can see that 2 newcomers are on number 4 and number 8 position, Beijing and Shanghai. And this is very significant of what's happening in the region, the emergence of China. China was not, no Chinese city were in the 20 first startup ecosystem before, and now Beijing jumped immediately at the 4th rank and Shanghai at the 8th rank. And Singapore is here, but only at the 12th place. So that's, we'll come back on this later because it's important to understand Thailand within the region. Let's talk about unicorns now. I don't know if you're all familiar with unicorns. Unicorns are these startups that are valued more than $1 billion. There are 197 unicorns today in the world. You probably don't know most of them, right? I don't know half of them, but you know Grab Taxi, you know Uber, you know Airbnb, maybe you know Pinterest, and probably a few more. So where are the 197 startups? 100 of them are in the USA, and 50 of them are in China. That's probably why we don't know so many of them, right? Because you can see that most of these Chinese startups, we never heard about them. 10 are in India, 2 are in Singapore. Actually, Grab is a Malaysian company, but now it's registered in Singapore. We'll get back on that later. And 1 is in Indonesia. What's very important with this map is that you can see that Thailand and Southeast Asia are squeezed between China and India, 2 very important startup ecosystems, and need to survive, right? Need to make a living. Now, if we focus on Southeast Asia and Thailand, these are numbers that everybody probably know already. Thailand, the 2nd largest economy in the region after Indonesia, a strategic location, the first tourism destination with more than 30 million tourists in 2016, and a very good cost of life versus development ratio. Number that maybe you're not so familiar with are the internet connection and the mobile subscription. 46 million internet users, 67% of penetration rate, and 90 million mobile subscriptions. So these are good numbers, but when you compare with the rest of SEA, Thailand is never number 1, never number 2. Well, number 2 for the GDP, but most of the time number 4 or number 5. There are always countries that are richer or countries that are bigger than Thailand, and that occupy the places before. And that's important to understand that, to understand the place now of the Thailand ecosystem in the region. Before I go into the Thai startup ecosystem, I'd like to talk about the history of the Thai startup ecosystem very, very quick. There are 4 phases, sorry, before 2012, 2012 to 2013. So before 2012, what I call the era of local players. 2012, 2013, what I call the rise of the telcos and the rocket internet invasion. These are 2 very important events in the Thai startup scene. 2013, 2015, what I call the rocket internet effect. We'll come back on that later. And since 2016, market concentration. So before 2012, the Thai scene is dominated by local players. Sanook.com is the Yahoo. Agoda is Expedia. Tara.com is Amazon. There is no Amazon in Southeast Asia and in Thailand. And Sogo is Groupon, right? So there is not much happening in Thailand before 2012. And two big events will happen in 2012, 2013, and change the tech scene and encourage the emergence of Thai startup. The first one is what I call the rise of the telcos. It's when True, AIS, and DTAC start investing in startup and being interested in startup because they see opportunities for them to develop new business models and to find new customers. True is disrupting the TOT monopoly. So TOT is the government company for telephony and internet. And True has always been trying to be better than TOT and to offer better solution. And in 2013, True is the first one to launch 4G in Thailand. And that's very important because you need a good internet, right, to have startups and tech startups and tech companies. And True has been very active in providing a good internet and in helping the technology to develop. AIS was the first one to invest $2 million in a Thai startup called Ukbi. Ukbi is an e-book startup, that's why Ukbi e-book. But what's important is that was the first time that a local Thai startup raised money, is helped by an investor. Actually, AIS is the main customer of Ukbi, but still they help to invest in startup and to show that it's possible in Thailand to raise money. That happened in 2012 too. And in 2013, DTAC launched the first startup accelerator program called DTAC Accelerate. And that's the first time that a corporate is helping the Thai startups to develop, to create, and to develop. So that's a very important event for the Thai startup. But there is an even more important event, in my opinion, that's Rocket Internet. So what is Rocket Internet? Rocket Internet is what we call the venture builders or a startup studio. It means that they're building startup. Right? They're based in Berlin, and they specialize in what we call copycat of successful startups, right? Basically, they copy what's working in other places. They started very early. In 1999, they created Zalando, which was a European version of eBay, and they sold it to eBay for $43 million. Then they created in 2008 Zalando, which was a copy of Zappos, which is shoes and fashion online. And then their big deal was to create CityDeal in 2010. CityDeal was the European Groupon. So they launched CityDeal, expand in Europe, and then very, very quickly they sold Groupon to they sold CityDeal, sorry, to Groupon for more than $100 million. So in 2012, you have this Rocket Internet company that has a lot of money and a lot of ideas because the ideas are actually to copy other businesses. So what they do in 2012 is they start being interested in Southeast Asia. And they come up in Southeast Asia with 4 brands that you are probably very familiar with. Lazada, which is the equivalent of Amazon. Zalora, which is a copy of their copycats, right? Zalora is Zalando and Zalando is Zappos. Foodpanda, which is a food delivery business. This is also a model that exists in Europe and in the US. And Easy Taxi, which is a copy of Uber and Grab. But they don't just they not just come with these brands. They don't not just launch these companies in Thailand. The way they launch them is very aggressive. They're here to win the market. So if you allow me an analogy with a very popular TV show right now, this is the Thailand startup scene in early 2012, right? Pretty much very quiet, not much happening. And this is the Rocket Internet invasion, right? That's when they come, and it's gonna be terrible. But it's a real comparison because Rocket Internet is really changing the rule and disrupting the industry. They come up with new business model, which is we spend first, we make money later. Sanook.com, Tara.com were traditional businesses, right? You start your business, you make money, you reinvest your money. Rocket Internet is not that. Lazada, Zalora, Foodpanda, they spend more money than they earn, right? But they get all the money coming from Europe, from Rocket Internet. They come with new business ethics. Basically no rules. We don't respect the rules of Thailand or Malaysia or whatever. We do business the way we want. The goal is to make money. So at the beginning, people don't like them, right? If you remember Lazada in the early days, people didn't really like the way they were conducting business. They also come with new recruitment methods. They're poaching people from other companies. They're offering high salaries. They're offering cool startup offices and free lunch. So they're changing the game, basically. They are not here to play by the current rule. They're here to impose their rules. And it works. And the other thing that they're doing is that they're bringing a lot of talents, because they're recruiting consultants and investment bankers and other talents in London, in Paris, in New York, in Berlin. And they're sending them to Bangkok, to Jakarta, to Manila, etc. So that's why I call it the Rocket Internet effect, because Rocket Internet brought a lot of new talents to Thailand, and they completely changed the landscape, bringing new rules, new businesses, and new people. Thailand start to have new people, also start to attract investors, and Bangkok becomes a cool place for startup funders, right? And more of that is that a lot of Rocket Internet executives leave Rocket Internet and start creating their own startups. If you know Hotel Quickly, Pomelo, or Rabbit Internet, these are ex-Rocket Internet executives. So we have the emergence of a vibrant tech startup scene that is very, very much developed and supported by this outside player of the industry. Unfortunately, 2016 and 2017 are the years of a big market concentration. Lazada is bought by Alibaba, the Chinese player. Zalora is bought by Central Group. Foodpanda is bought by Delivery Hero, and Easy Taxi disappear. I guess most of you don't even know Easy Taxi, right? It's gone. We don't even know it was there at some point. Now Uber and Grab are ruling the place. So no more high-profile Rocket Internet venture, which means, unfortunately, no more new talents, no more foreign talents, no more new startups. The scene is slowing down, and what we witness now is a bit different. It's an invasion by giant tech companies or giant startups coming from China, Alibaba, Tencent, and Financial. So Tencent invested in Sanook.com, and Financial invested in Ascend, which is True Money. USA, right? Amazon is coming. They're not there yet, but they're already in Singapore, and they're gonna come. Uber Eats is here. Expedia, Netflix is coming. From Singapore, Property Guru, they're becoming the leading real estate portal in the region. And Traveloka from Indonesia is coming to fight with Agoda and the other travel people. The big difference with this company is that they're not building new stuff, they're not bringing new talents, they're acquiring local players and growing with local players. So they're not developing the industry, they're concentrating into a smaller number of players. It's still good for the scene because the scene is getting stronger, but most of them stay a foreign company and do not develop the local startup ecosystem. So where are we now? Where are we today? These are, by the way, these are Bangkok Entrepreneurs estimations, right? Because there is no official number of the startups in Thailand. So these are our numbers, right? Based on our experience. There are between 5,000 and 10,000 active startups in Thailand. 300 of them are what we call significant, which means that they really have activity and traction and are really growing. 200 of them, roughly, have raised money. 30 of them have raised more than $1 million. Out of these 30, 10 of them have raised more than $10 million, actually. You're one of them, right? Itigo is one of them. And there is no company that raised $100 million, and there is no unicorns. If you remember the 197 unicorns, none of them is in Thailand. So it's still a small startup scene. They are still happening, but it's not as big as what's happening in Singapore or in Indonesia, for instance. 15 Thai startups that you should know. I call them the $1 million club because they are startups that raise between $1 and $30 million. There are more than that. There are probably, as I said, more than 20 startups that raised $1 million, but I think that these ones are very significant in Thailand, and you probably already heard about them, or you will very soon. Let's start with e-commerce. So the blue one, that's an interesting thing. The startup that are marked in blue, it means that at least one of the co-founder is a foreigner, not Thai. And underline means that the headquarters is outside of Thailand. So the company, the staff is in Thailand, but the headquarters is outside of Thailand. So 11 of these 15 startups are actually founded or co-founded by foreigners, and 4 of them have headquarters outside of Thailand. If we look at them, e-commerce.
Technically, us too.
Technically, yeah.
Etigo is a Singaporean registered company, but with an operational headquarters in Thailand.
So you lied on Crunchbase, didn't you?
They asked us, what should we write? And we say, like, you write what you want. Our operational headquarters in Thailand, but our registration is in Singapore.
Okay, so we need to underline. We just lost one. We just lost one more startup. So Etigo should be underlined, and probably a few other more actually, because my study is based on the information that's available. Some of these startups, they're very quiet about this, right? Because Agoda is very famous, right, for having their headquarters in Singapore, but they have 2,000 people sitting here in Bangkok. So that's not an information that you find easily. But anyway. E-commerce is the most funded Thai startup, founded by the famous Srivarakul brothers. They raised more than $28 million, and they're into logistics in Thailand and in Indonesia. Ukbi, we mentioned before, right? They raised $2 million in 2012. Now they are $28 million. Omise, FinTech company, they're offering a payment solution and also working on blockchain, $20 million. Etigo, Michael will tell you more about Etigo, restaurant booking startup, backed by TripAdvisor, $15 million. Pomelo, e-commerce success. Pomelo is expanding in Southeast Asia with $12 million. 2C2P is a competitor of Omise. They're also doing FinTech. 2C2P is working with Facebook on some payment solutions, so they're also doing very well, $10 million. Zilingo is a e-commerce company that started from scratch as a regional company, which means you can buy from Singapore and Thailand, from Indonesia to Malaysia, etc. $9 million. ROCKETINTERNET, a joint venture between the BTS group and a private group, $9 million. Echo is interested because it's founded by Korawat Sheravanand. His dad is the CEO of True, and his granddad is the CEO of CP Group. So this company, Echo, has already among their customers True, CP Group, and all the company of this group, and they raised $6.7 million, so that's a company that we will follow. Hotel Quickly, hotel booking company that's going after Agoda on their own turf with $5.66 million. And then the other one are less important, but you will probably hear about them too: Playbasis, Medical Departure, ClaimD, Wong Nai, Restaurant Reviews, and Priceda. The key verticals in Thailand and the key players, the key verticals are the top line: e-commerce, travel, fintech, logistics and transportation. These are really where most of the startups are created and where most of the investment go. And then the second category, food delivery, grocery delivery, restaurant booking and ticketing, are where we see a lot of startups here in Thailand. Accelerators and VCs and investors, so the telcos I mentioned before, right? AIS, DTAC, True, are supporting the startup and investing in the startup, but mainly at the first round stage, right? At the very early stage. The banks and the corporates are coming, but they're not really there yet, so they're not really ready to invest into startups. Actually, right now, the most active investors in startups are the foreign VCs. They come from Singapore, they come from China, they come from Japan, and they invest in the startup. There is a clear lack of private accelerators here in Thailand, and local active VCs at a second stage or a third stage of development. Offices and space, it's important to mention that there is a new way of working now in Thailand with the emergence of co-working spaces, serviced offices, low-cost offices. Now you can find an office in an accelerator or in a startup studio. You can even find an office in a shopping center, right? Central Embassy is providing the open house, the TCDC that was in Emporium moved somewhere else. But so the point is now there are more and more opportunities for remote workers to work from different places and for entrepreneurs to start temporary offices, of course at a lower cost. Tech events and organization. One regional event that is happening almost every year in Thailand is Echelon. And then you have local networking events, the one we organize with Bangkok Entrepreneurs, but also the web meetup and some others, and also some tech conferences, Startup Summit, Tech Source, the government event. There are some organizations like us, like Haba, like others, but there is no central organization in Thailand to support the Thai startup, and that's probably something that's that should be implemented if Thailand wants to really develop a startup community that can compete with the startup communities in the region. In terms of government, there is a program, right, called Thailand 4.0. There are a lot of funds, promises, but so far no real investment and no active support. So I think that's also something that's very crucial for the Thai tech startup ecosystem, is that if it wants to develop quickly and efficiently, it needs to take example of what Singapore is doing, which is not running the ecosystem, but supporting the ecosystem. A good example is what Singapore did with Grab. Remember, we mentioned Grab before as one of the unicorns of Singapore, but I told you it's a Malaysian company. So Singapore has a national fund, right, that is run by a separate entity called Temasek. Temasek is the organization that manages the fund of the national wealth of Singapore. And then Temasek have created their own VC, their own venture capital fund that's called Vertex. So when the Singapore government want to support Thai startup, they don't do it directly. They don't go directly to startup. They have people whose job is to do that and who know how to do that. So when Vertex invested in Grab, that was not the first round, right? Grab was already up and going in Malaysia. But Vertex managed to have Grab relocate their headquarters from Malaysia to Singapore. And that's very important for an ecosystem, because this is the kind of company that you can mention and boost about, right? So now Grab is listed as a Singaporean company, not a Malaysian company. So I think that's what the Thai government needs to understand, is that you don't need to run the whole ecosystem. You need to find the right partners and allocate the right money to the right people so that the ecosystem develops by itself and that more companies, more investment, and more talents come directly to Thailand. Just to finish very quickly, the challenges that will come for Thailand and Southeast Asia. David will tell you more about that later, but very quickly, as I said before, Thailand is never number one, and I think that's an issue. Singapore is the Silicon Valley of Southeast Asia, right? That's where there are entrepreneurs and investors and banks and headquarters. Malaysia has a strong and efficient government support. Indonesia has a population, 260 million people, 40% of Southeast Asia is in Indonesia. Vietnam is more foreign friendly with entrepreneurs. The Philippines speak better English, and even Myanmar is starting to challenge Thailand in some ways. So Thailand has to be very careful. There are some opportunities, of course. Asia is the leading market for startups and tech in the future because of the population, because of the investment, because of the momentum. And Thailand has a role to play as a regional hub. But first, in my opinion, Asia needs to be more innovative, stop copying, and start really launching new ideas, new startups. Itigo is one of them, so congratulations to Itigo. Southeast Asia needs to compete with China and India, and that's going to be a tough one too. Southeast Asia is squeezed between China and India, and they really need to find their mark. And Thailand inside Southeast Asia need to establish themselves as a key country. How to do so? Working on the social, the legal, and the financial. Social is to attract more foreign talents for Thai startup, because they need also foreign talent, and for foreign startups. Legal is to make business easy for startups, like visa, work permits, etc. And financial, probably the most important of all. improve regulation and banking system so that foreign investors feel comfortable in investing in Thai startup, investing in Thailand. And that's it for me. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Bart. It's a very very insightful information. You know, I have been in the startups. I've been covering startups for quite some times, and your information is very insightful. And it's very true. It's very truthful. It speaks a lot about what's been going on in the Thai startup ecosystem. So up next, I would like to invite David Shelter to speak about the challenges. You know, before you know we came on stage, we were briefly discussing about a lot of issue. You know, many of issue comes with the Thailand 4.0 policies that comes from, you know, the Thai government recently was trying to improve the infrastructures of the technology investments. But does it really go to a, you know, to a right direction? Does it really what startups really want? And what are other challenges? David, take it away.
Hello. I'm going to be here tonight talking about the challenges and opportunities for Thai startups. But first, I just want to give some background on myself. I've been in the entrepreneurial space for over 20 years, the last 9 years here in Bangkok, Thailand. I've been, my first startup, so it's actually 23 years ago, I had my FinTech startup, registered, co-founded the smallest registered commodity trading advisor in the world at the time. And then my second startup in America was in the digital media space. I come here 9 years ago, and back in 2008, there was no startup community. But I partnered with my friend Ben Sherry, who had a successful lean and agile development shop with all Thai developers. And my friend Ben is very well known in the States of building startup development teams for Fortune 500 companies, and he saw the tech talent here, and we got together as about 70 expats, and we started the IT Startup Association of Thailand, and we started the community building process here. It was mostly mentoring Thai startups, which was hard to find at the time because there's really no community. We started organizing the first bar camps here. The first one was in 2008, and that was really not a startup conference, it was more like a geek conference, so techies just came in and shared notes. And that's when I started my first Finance for Geeks presentations, where I gave strategic and financial advice to tech startups. And that was the name of my first blog, 2011, 2012, Finance for Geeks. Then in 2013, I co-founded a blog called Thailand Startup Review with my associate Ian Corman, who's here today. And we covered the Thai startup scene. We were in the English language, and half our audience was, approximately half our audience was outside of Thailand and half here. And we promoted events here. Our function was to promote the Thai startup community and give information. We had a calendar, event calendar, and all that. Since that time, I've been board advisor to many startups, about 24 startups I've advised, helped raise money for, and in all different spaces here. I also teach entrepreneurship at several universities here, Sassoon, Chula, Bangkok U, Chiang Mai University. So I've taught entrepreneurship, and I'm involved with several organizations. I'm a member of the ICT and SME committees of the Joint Foreign Chambers of Commerce, co-founder of Bangkok FinTech Alliance. I am a national eminent expert for the World Summit Awards, which is a UN-sponsored competition for social impact ventures. In fact, it's the biggest in the world. And I helped, and I founded the nomination committee here, so Thai social entrepreneurs can compete in the competition. And that was back in 2013. And so we have a lot of great social entrepreneurship here in Thailand. When you put together the tech talent here, and the fact that this is a Buddhist country and charity is very big, and people want to help their fellow people, you put those two together, and you have some really great social entrepreneurship ventures here. So I'm also an author. The first 3 titles up there are full-length books. It's a Finance for Geeks trilogy. So the first book, Startup Guide, published by John Wiley, That is, I'm giving financial advice, almost like a mentoring session for tech startups on finance and strategy and how to develop a financial plan. And I introduce conceptual tools to help startups do that, entrepreneurs do that. The second book is bootstrapping strategies, where I use the same conceptual tools for them to build a bootstrapping plan, which is how to basically go as far in your life cycle without having to raise funds. And then the third book, just recently published 4 months ago, Building Startup Ecosystems. I introduce a methodology, a qualitative methodology of how to measure the progress of the development of individual startup ecosystems. And in that book, to illustrate my methodology, which is called the vibrancy rating, I provide a narrative of the development of the Thai startup community. And so that was the third book. So they're all together in a trilogy. So the methodology I introduced in the third book is based on some building blocks that I did in the bootstrapping book. And so I've also published the Thailand Startup Funding Report. This is a comprehensive list of all the VC funding transactions in Thailand. And so I give aggregate data on those lists. So every year I come out with that report that I team up again with my associate Ian Corman on that. And so that just gives a list of each funding transaction, the funding recipients, the round, the amount if disclosed, who the investors were involved, and then I also give analysis in the reports about what happened this past year and what to expect in the next year. And so there's analysis, there's aggregate data, and then of course the list. Those are the things that I publish, and I have an Amazon page for that. The challenges and opportunities, it's very interesting. We were at, in my third book, I gave a history of the development of the Thai startup community. And I kind of like how Bart did it, because he's coming from a different perspective, but almost the same conclusions. So up to, in my methodology, there's 5 different stages in development of a startup ecosystem. You have no community, community building, dysfunctional community, functional community, and vibrant community. And I go through all the different stages that Thailand's been through. We're at the functional stage, but we're not quite at the vibrancy stage, and there's some hurdles we have to overcome to get to that stage. And my methodology is qualitative because we have a lot of quantitative methodologies out there to do this, and they're wrong because they're comparing apples with oranges. Things like the dynamics of the startup community, which is actually important to talk about when I talk about the challenges and opportunities now, is really important that you can't really quantitatively measure. But this is, so a whole point of the startup community is is about how it supports startups, not, how it's good for investors, or how much investment there's been, or even for the consumers, or for government making their KPIs. It's about providing the financial, relational, knowledge resources that startups need. And this will help help all the 7 different players in a startup community. So the players are entrepreneurs, investors, media, government, educational institutions, startup organizations. So all these 7 players have a role to play, and in each stage, their roles change. So with this, you can have almost a blueprint. Okay, we're in this stage. These are the different roles that each of the 7 players need to play to keep the startup ecosystem going. And as I said, we're in the functional stage now, and we've kind of the last year, to my surprise, actually, I didn't think I did the methodology. I didn't think this could happen, but in the dynamic score, we're actually digressing because of what's happened with, the increased corporate engagement was good, and the increased interest in the government's good, but it's been, there's some issues there with, with some of the policies, and so that, are they really helping, but I'll go through the opportunities first for startups before I go into the challenges. The opportunity is we're at a stage where, Bart kind of talked about a little bit. We're at a stage where before, from 2012 to let's say 2014, 15, most successful startups were pretty much copying other business models outside. There wasn't too much innovation with different kind of advanced technologies. It was, there was the market opportunities was still wide open here in Thailand. And so there are startups that came up and emerged that mostly in the e-commerce and marketplace areas that there was easy pickings, the opportunities, they came in, they were successful. But then we're getting into a phase now where those opportunities are dissipating, especially in the e-commerce space. What happened was e-commerce really started growing in 2012 here, and it has showed nice growth up to 2015, but then the e-commerce market got big enough so that the big players that Bart mentioned came in, and that flattened the margins. And so what happened was that now it made it difficult for e-commerce startups to really thrive because the bigger players came in and took over. So we're just in the different stages. So it requires a different kind of startup to succeed here. So now you have to be more innovative. Maybe you have to find niche markets. So this is the startup. But the opportunity here is that there's more corporate engagement. And like Bart said, the first wave of corporates were the telcos. And they came in, and they had app stores, so it made sense for them. They wanted to support startups that develop apps and who've been in the app stores. I don't know, usually it's like, well, we want to go in more innovative business models and things like that. That really wasn't, I don't think, their intention. They just simply wanted to, support the apps that's going to help the sales in their app stores. But they played a critical role, though, in the development of the startup community, because they were able to co-market. So it's not so much the funding they gave, it was the co-marketing support for these. And these first startups are successful, and that inspired other people to become entrepreneurs here. So so they played a critical role. And then we saw the next phase of type of corporate come in 2016, and those were the banks. So the FinTech became hot. So the banks decided to come in and get through it. But most importantly, what we see, and that's always commanding the news right now, FinTechs and the banks and the banking accelerators and stuff like that. But the most promising thing that's happened is going to give the greatest opportunities for startups, is that corporates in more traditional industries, are coming into play. And so as a startup, your value now is not going to be like an e-commerce or marketplace. What's the revenues? What's the size of the market? What's the consumers? Now, startups that can create strategic value for these companies, let's say like Siam Cement or PTT, companies with strategic value, they can really become successful, and they'll actually command higher valuations because their valuations is based on strategic value and not just the numbers. Here's where the opportunity lies. And also, we're going to move into the startups that are going to be successful and have the best opportunities now, are startups that are going to be operating in spaces in industries that Thailand has traditionally been strong in. So agriculture, medical field, e-travel, these fields are going to be, if you're a startup and you can create strategic value for some of these big corporations in these already thriving industries. So these are where the opportunities are. It's going to be in these particular strong industries that have been traditionally strong in Thailand, and also if you can create strategic value for corporations that exist here. And so those are the opportunities. But the challenges, it's very interesting. The challenges, because we've developed, so we're at a stage where now it all comes down to how the dynamics of the startup community, the engagement by the government. And so there's been a lot of encouraging things in that a few years ago, the government had paid no attention to us, and didn't even know we existed, the startup community. And now it's gone full tilt, full turnaround, where they're doing, their intent is very strong to support the startup community. They've shown their willingness to allocate a lot of resources to support it, but sometimes it might not be so informed, it might not be so coordinated. So we had what's called Digital 0.40 economy, which is very good intention. It's to transform Thailand from a middle, out of the middle income gap to a more advanced economy. It's very well intentioned, and it's come from the top up. And so from the top, from the Prime Minister's office, we have these Digital 0.40. We have all these objectives coming down, and so, but there's no strategy. So the objectives are coming down, and what we see is we have maybe 20 different agencies within government seeing that the Digital 0.40, these are the objectives, and they're all trying to figure out their own ways to meet those objectives. And so there's a lot of discoordination there because there's not a strategy with the objectives. And so we see a lot of, it's kind of inefficient and kind of dysfunctional in a way. And it's caused some disruption in the dynamics of the startup community that was one of our strong suits for the community. People talk about Singapore as a successful startup hub, and they have all the resources, but their startup community dynamics has always been poor compared to Thailand. But now here we're kind of digression in the dynamics part of what we need to be strength for the startup community. And so what happens? So I'll just give a few examples. So the government's come out and said we're going to give income tax holidays just to tech startups. You don't have to pay any income tax. Well, that sounds great, but if you're a pre-revenue startup or you're a startup, most of your life cycle is spent where you're not even profitable. So you don't have any taxable income anyway. But if you turn around and say, okay, we're going to have a new e-commerce tax, and so if you're a startup in the e-commerce space, all of a sudden every one of your transactions is going to be taxed, and you have to, and the compliance cost can be even greater than the actual tax you have to pay. Then and these are for pre-revenue startups that apply. So is it really helping? So there's no common strategy of how to help the startups. So we're in there's a lot of still pervasive in government circles here is a lot of like rent-seeking mentality. So tech startups are going to be successful. Let's go ahead and tax it. And so this is just one example with the taxes we're talking about with e-commerce, but also even go higher end. Talk about the spectrum, the spectrum auctions. Thailand had one of the most expensive ones, in the world, and that was good for it helped the government coffers. But that money could have been used by the telcos to really expand their networks into areas in the countryside and areas that aren't so touched. So we have to. There has to be a common strategy that we still need. When I was in Sri Lanka in 2013, they had an interesting model that's really succeeded there, and that's something that maybe Thailand can emulate. So in Sri Lanka, we have, so in 2013, they just finished their really bloody civil war there. And so there was a lot of, during that time, there was a lot of need to kind of get everybody united again. And they actually did this with technology policy, not just to help their startup communities, but also actually build the community and get it united again. And so what they had is an agency called ICTA, and what they did was it was one agency that did the policy making. Okay, so people that wanted inputs could go to that one agency and express their inputs and help them with information. And all the policies were created in this ICTA, and then once the common strategy was out and common objectives, then they allocated a division of labor. They allocated to different agencies, different ministries, what they needed to do to implement the overall policy. And that's something that we really sorely need here. I think Bart mentioned in one of his slides, the fact that we need something central, and it's very important that we get to that point. So it's very heartening that the government wants to help us, but we in the private sector we also have an obligation. We can't expect them to make the right policy decisions and wait for them to make policy decisions. We have to be proactive and help them and advise them on this. And fortunately, the government has been very willing to engage, increasingly engage with people that are expertise in these areas. So it's very promising. But in the government, you have a mixed bag. You have some agencies that are very proactive. You know, the SEC was very proactive in getting the crowdfunding regulations going. You know, and so Chairman Vorapal, the former chairman, was really took leadership in that. And then you have other agencies that are really pushing things along, and then you have other agencies that are still hesitant about change or maybe a little bit protective about maybe some of the corporations. Because in startup community, you have to allow, to be a successful startup community, you have to allow for disruption. And in a country where there's certain monopolies or certain interests that have been strong for decades, it's something that's going to be that's an obstacle that has to be overcome. But what's good is the corporate engagement. It shows signs that in the corporate community they're willing to do that. They're willing to work with startups to become more competitive, because in the end that's just value and the strength of a startup community is how the innovations of the startups can be leveraged by the bigger companies and government to make the country more competitive. So when people look at the startup community, they shouldn't look at, well, how many jobs do startups create? What's their revenues? That's not how to really evaluate how strong and how much startup community contributes. It's really how much more competitive is the country, and how much more consumer choice and things like that these innovative startups bring and can be leveraged.
David,
yes.
I have a quick question for you. So, you've been talking about how the Thailand digital 4.0s, play out in the, Thai startups ecosystem, and it's really interesting to hear from you actually, in the startups community. What do they think about the Thai's policies that helping out? Is it really truly helping them out, especially on the early stage investments?
So two of the things that the government has been committed a lot of resources and effort to is I think nearly $500 million has been pledged to support startups. And so maybe 3 or 4 years ago, it was a proverbial tin cup for startups. It was hard to find money. But now, if you're an investment grade venture in Thailand, we can find funding for you between the local investors and the foreign investors, from Singapore, Korea, Japan, China. We can find investors for you. In fact, the investors that I talk to, their complaint is we can't find enough investment grade ventures. And those are really the ventures that need to be funded. Right now, one of the KPIs we hear is, well, we want to create 10,000 startups by so-and-so. It's not a numbers game, We should be focusing on startups that are going to create innovations, that are going to solve a problem, solve an issue that is for Thailand, or make Thailand more competitive. What happened in Singapore was you had all these agencies. This was similar. We had all these agencies that were in these particular industries, and they provided all this funding. So now you had 50 startups cannibalizing each other, and the startups that should survive had a hard time. So the startup ecosystem is a balance. It's a balance, and this is where the dynamics come in. So you had $500 million of pledged funding. Well, that crowds out the private sector VCs, which is important. So the government's coming up with a lot of events. Well, some of the event organizers, traditional event organizers in the startup space, it's crowding them out. So sometimes you can help too much. But really, the most help that a government can do, this is not just in Thailand, but in general, is regulatory relief. And so the best things to help startups have nothing to do with startups. It has to do with ease of doing business here, just make a better business climate. So
get out of the way.
Yeah, just the best thing to do is sometimes just get out of the way. And
sometimes it's also giving maybe less regulatory, but also promoting the ways of investing, because startup is also it's a little bit different than SMEs, as we know. The business models of startups is a little bit different. So David, thank you very much, because we are running out of time a little bit, but thank you for your insightful information. So I would like to move on to Michael. He's a co-founder of Itigo. I mean, Itigo is actually one of the applications that I use. I don't know if you guys are familiar with Itigos. Raise your hands if you have Itigos on your smartphones. Use it on. Very nice. Basically, Itigo is a mobile application that actually lets you search the restaurants that near your location. Use your GPS, and it's actually would see what's they rate the restaurant, the review, and you can also book make a reservations of the restaurant as well. So I'm just gonna let Michael tell us about his business model and how he doing business in Thailand. Actually, one of his co-founder is also Thai. So Itigo is pretty much a lot. It's also been adapted to a Thai tech ecosystem a lot. So I'm gonna let Michael explain about that.
All right, thanks, Mike, and thank you again for having us here on this panel. My name is Michael. I am the CEO and co-founder of Itigo, and maybe my perspective is going to be a little bit different from my previous speakers, because they give you a very top bird's eye view, strategic view of the ecosystem in Thailand. I'm going to give you a view from a startup, right? From interacting with the ecosystem and what's important for us. I'll tell you a little bit about Itigo first, so to introduce you to the company and to the business model behind it, and then I'm going to end with a slide that we're currently operating in 6 countries. I'm going to compare the ecosystems and what it means for us for those 6 countries that we're operating in. So it gives you I'm not going into countries where we're not, but I'll give you a good startup view of how does Thailand measure up versus Singapore, or versus India, or versus Malaysia, etc. That might be of interest. All right, let's see if that works. Okay, so talking about challenges and opportunities in the Thai startup ecosystem for us. Welcome to Itigo, that's our office, right? You can see before people come in the morning, right? We start relatively late, but we work relatively late as well. And what are we? Okay, Itigo is a restaurant reservation platform. We're the biggest restaurant reservation platform in Southeast Asia. Our numbers change fast, so you have to forgive me, they're not fully updated here. We've actually seated well over 5 million people so far, almost seating 1 million diners on a monthly basis. That's us, 6 markets, Thailand, Singapore, Malaysia, Hong Kong, Philippines, and India, seating, as I said, about 1 million people a month across those 6 markets, over 2 million installs of the application, and we have currently about 2,000 restaurants on our platform. And see, the special thing about Itigo is that every single restaurant on Itigo that you can book is discounted every day, all day, and every last restaurant on Itigo offers 50% discount at some part of the day. You can book every of these 2,000 restaurants at 50% off every day. Right? Not the whole day, right? But at some point in the day. And it makes for an inventory that is absolutely unique on the planet. Right? If I tell you have 2,000 restaurants, you'll say, so what? Other people have too. If I say every one of these restaurants is bookable at 50% every day, it makes for something that is unique. We spoke about funding already. We've raised a bit over $15 million so far in total. We've raised exclusively from strategic investors. I don't like VC, I don't like PE. I can tell you a little bit more about this afterwards for my reasons, but we've always gone for strategic money, corporate investors. Our first series was, we bootstrapped for a long time. First series was born by a Thai company who is in the media business, the biggest outdoor company, there's outdoor media in Thailand. The second round was carried in full by TripAdvisor, big American listed company, of course, by now. We go strong. We're almost 4 years old, but we're still growing very strongly. We're doing about 6x growth year on year, almost every year. And the thing I'm most proud of in Itigo is if you have a lot of startups and you ask everybody who is growing 6x year on year, and all the hands go up. If you ask who is doing this on positive unit economics, all the hands go down because they don't make money. They have income, but they're not profitable, right? And Itigo is different from almost any startup in the e-commerce space that you know in Southeast Asia by being able to say that we have positive unit economics. What does it mean, positive unit economics? It means, in a bit of tech jargon, our LTV is bigger than our CAC. Let me translate that for the non-startup people. It means that our lifetime value from our customers is bigger than our customer acquisition cost. In other words, I make more money from every customer that I acquire than it costs me to acquire that user. That seems sensical, right, to you, but for most startups, this is not the case. It costs them more to acquire a user than in the lifetime of that user they make from that startup. Ask Lazada about that, right? If you told them be profitable for a month or die, they would just lay down and die because they couldn't do it, right? For us, our LTV, our lifetime value, is 3 to 4 times bigger than our customer acquisition cost, and that is something again that is special about the company. Our elevator pitch. Elevator pitch is how you introduce people to your company in, I don't know, in my case, maybe 10 seconds, right? For Itigo, it's pretty straightforward. Is what we do is we connect empty tables with empty stomachs. That's what we do, right? And we do it via a system of time-based discounts. You can see this down here that for all the restaurants that you see on Itigo, you'll see that at different times the discounts that we offer change dramatically. Usually in peak hours, they're very small, 10%, 15%. In off-peak hours, when the restaurant wants you to come, the discounts go up to 30, 40, 50%. Every restaurant offers 50% at some parts of the day, right? So this is what we do. Follow me a little bit into our business model. The problem that we solve is the very unsexy thing of capacity utilization. I'm an economist, so you have to forgive me. I don't have to be very sexy. What is capacity utilization? Capacity utilization is the fact that restaurants are very inefficient on when their users come. You can see that traditional restaurant I got 2 slides mixed up here, actually. I want this first here. You can see that airlines and hotels are very good at capacity utilization. They run at about 80% on a global base, meaning 80% of their inventories are sold out. Right? If you go into a plane, it's usually about 80% full. Hotels that are successful run at about 80% capacity utilization. Restaurants are really, really poor at that. That is global data here. It's not Thai data, right? And globally, restaurants operate at about 30, 35% capacity utilization. Now you put that into your mind a bit. Like, if you look at the global market of restaurants, proper restaurants, sit-down places, not QSRs and food courts I'm talking, like real restaurants. There's a market size of 2.3 trillion US dollars. So there's a market that is 2.3 trillion big, and it's operating at an efficiency level of 30%. Right? So talking about big pies, if I can just increase the efficiency of this market to say 40%, I'm creating out of thin air a market that is incremental and didn't exist before on a global scale of about 260 billion US dollars. And we're the first company in the world to work that angle. We're a first mover globally, so we're working a pie that is extremely big, easily over $200 billion. It's global, and it's blue ocean because nobody's doing it yet. So that's why we want to work on this, and that's why Itigo is in that business. The reasons why restaurants are so bad at capacity utilization is because of their day. Their day is a 2-peak day. I'm a telco guy in my previous life, and the telco day is very similar to a restaurant day. It's a 2-peak day. It's like nothing, nothing lunch, nothing, nothing, nothing dinner, nothing, nothing, right? And that doesn't make for a very nice, even curve for capacity utilization. And what we do in Itigo, we flatten that curve. We move traffic overflow from peak hours to off-peak hours and given over the day better capacity utilization for the restaurant. How we do this? By discounts. Right? We tell the user the restaurant has a queue at 12 o'clock for lunch. I'm not going to give you a discount then because I don't need you to come at that time. But at 11 a.m. or at 1:30, if you come a bit earlier or a bit later, that restaurant's already empty. And if you come then, I'm going to give you a nice discount to come a bit early or come a bit late. And that works really well with restaurants, and it sets us apart from other players. Because if you look at traditional reservation platforms like say OpenRice in the US, you might know Chope from Singapore, etc. They send 90% of their traffic in off-peak hours, in peak hours. That's also true for Groupon and other social buying platforms. We at Etigo send 90% of our traffic in off-peak hours, and that's exactly why I've been on the record with the press a couple of times calling us the anti-Groupon. We're not the anti-Groupon because we don't like them or we fight with them. We're the anti-Groupon because the service that we provide to the merchant is the diametrical opposite of what Groupon does, or what OpenTable does, or what Chope does. We send people when you really want them. We shape the traffic, and we can deliver the users to you whenever you want them. We have some merchants, for example, the Peninsula Hotel in Bangkok, that tells us, I want all my traffic at 6 p.m. sharp. And we do that. We send 98% of all our customers to the Peninsula at 6 p.m. sharp. When do you think there's a 50% discount slot at the Peninsula in Bangkok? Take a guess, right? Okay, good. So this is how it works, right? So it's actually a pretty straightforward business model. And we're in the business of price discrimination, which means charging different people a different price for the exact same product, right? That is something that you know very well, because every airline in the world does that, and every hotel in the world does it. Actually, it was pioneered by American Airlines in the 1970s. So it's not something new. It's no mumbo jumbo. It is something that is tried and tested. It's been around for over 40 years. And we could fly to New York tomorrow and sit next to each other in the same plane, in the same cabin, same class, and maybe I pay 3 times for my ticket than what he paid, just because of when I booked and where I booked. It's called yielding, right? When Thai Airways or Thai Asia says, hey, fly to Singapore for 10 baht, that's not yielding, that's a promotion. It's not sustainable. But the fact that the last flight on Friday night costs 2 times as much as the Wednesday afternoon flight, that is yielding, right? And that's what we do for restaurants. We work with everybody, I always say. Like, I like to go from McDonald's to Michelin, right? And so we work with the big AAAs, we work with big hotels, and we work with independent restaurants. So the important thing to be an Etigo restaurant is that you have to be popular. See, it doesn't work if you're not popular, because if I tell people I have a great offer for you at a place you don't know, you don't like, will you come early or late to get a discount? No, you wouldn't. But if I tell you have a great place that you know and you love and you go to anyhow, I know Wine Connection is very popular for us right now, right? And all you need to do to get a 50% discount is come a bit earlier or a bit later. People do it, right? And we do this with stuff like Zen or Coffee Club, or up to we have Michelin-starred restaurants in Hong Kong, for example, right? We have a website, but we're very much a mobile-first platform. 95% of all our reservations happen on the mobile platform, right? On the applications. It's not buying a car, it's not a big investment decision. You as a user pay nothing for this service. We monetize via the merchants, and we charge them a fee per cover that we send. So for you, it's all free. So you are very comfortable making the decision on the snap, or I'm going to eat at Holiday Inn buffet tonight, or whatever, right? And now leading this to what I said before, you need to go a little bit better. We're in 6 markets, as I said. How does that compare Thailand to other markets? It's not a very pretty slide, right? But it gives you my personal, Etigo's view on comparing the Thai startup ecosystem versus other countries. I've ranked, this is a 5-scale ranking, right? Like 1 is really bad, 5 is top. And if you just look at this for a second, the first thing that strikes you is that Thailand doesn't look too bad, right? In fact, Thailand looks really good for two KPIs that are important for us. And as I say, when we rank this from a startup's perspective. And I think we mentioned it a little bit right now. For us, mainly, what do you need to do to make a startup happy is really get out of the way, right? Don't make it hard for me to get visas, to get people in. Don't make it hard for me to set up company. Don't make it hard for me to get tax breaks, right? You don't need to make 20 conferences a month to facilitate this or this, right? It's just get out of the way is very important. So funding, Thailand has issues. Right? We've discussed this. You've seen the companies that get funded in Thailand. If they get funded, how much they get funded. It's not a lot. Yeah, Accelerate's been around for a while, and they write ticket sizes anywhere from $100,000 to $500,000, maybe $1 million. Right? You couldn't raise a Series B in Thailand. For Thailand, yeah, not in Thailand. Right? So that's a topic. Nobody sets up shop in Thailand because they think, oh, this is really good for funding. There's other countries that I think Philippines probably almost a 1. Philippines is worse than Thailand, right? But on the other hand, see, like we just launched in the Philippines, and we became market leader within 4 months, right? We're going to break even in 6 months, in less than 6 months, right? For new startup, e-commerce startup, this is quite spectacular. And the reason why we picked Philippines as an expansion market is exactly that it has a weak funding ecosystem, because it means competition is weak. Nobody who is there has any money, right? And for us, when we picked Thailand, that we knew that it was very unlikely that we'd be funded from within Thailand, right? But we knew that there is not a lot of players in Thailand that are heavily funded. And we always planned to get our money from outside of Thailand. And that's actually, so if you're a small early stage startup in Thailand that wants to get funded, then this tool hurts you, right? But if you're another startup looking at Thailand, that doesn't hurt you at all. That actually makes it quite interesting. And you were telling us about the new wave of players that are coming in is the big boys, right? Now, why is the big boys coming in? Because the organic local competition is not strong because they're not well funded, right? So I think for Thailand as a whole, it's an ambivalent kind of like score, right? That makes it interesting for investments, but also not so in other aspects. Startup community, we actually scored it quite high, right? I don't see anybody that we feel community-wise is better. Didn't feel that Singapore, like there's a lot of events here, that the community is smaller than in other markets, but it's quite close-knit and it's quite easy to make the connections that you need to make. And from a startup's point of view, to facilitate your work, I've never experienced Thailand as a challenge. For me, that's clearly an opportunity, and I tell people that ask me, should I set up shop in Thailand, should I not do it? I recommend Thailand from this perspective, because I really think it's easy. OPEX cost and HR staff are different. OPEX cost, I'm looking at stuff, like rentals for offices and these kind of things. And again, I mean, if I compare Thailand there, for example, versus a Hong Kong or Singapore, right? I mean, things are much cheaper, much more cost efficient to do it here. Only maybe India better than Thailand and more cost effective. I also find it's good to find staff in Thailand. There's limits. For example, our development team is split in half. It's very easy for us to find good developers for iOS and for Android in Thailand, but it's very hard to find good, deep architects. So when you need math PhDs, I go back to Singapore and I go for Uzbeks and Kazakhs, right? Former USSR people with great master degrees, and there Singapore has clearly the edge in finding people. Government regulations, we find actually quite good in Thailand. There's deficiencies, but I'm putting this against other countries. We are BOI approved companies with nice tax breaks, unlimited hiring of foreigners, and relatively straightforward process to visa. So I think, at least from our perspective, we think Thailand does good here. Market size for Thailand is also good compared to the region. I mean, okay, Philippines and Indonesia are bigger, but purchase power is bigger in Thailand on that level. So if you want a mix of good purchase power and a lot of people, I think Thailand is attractive. Competition, due to the low funding, they go hand in hand. It's very low in Thailand, it's also very low in Philippines. That makes it worse in India, where people are lots of startups are funded really, really well. Of course, that makes the competitive situation more difficult. And maybe the last point, consumer maturity. Now, I scored this red because the consumer maturity in Thailand is low. Now, depending on what your business model is, that might be just what you want. For us, as an e-commerce company, educating people costs time and money. So it's easier to deal with users that are already e-commerce savvy because they get what we're doing quicker and they convert quicker. So for us, this is a 2, and in that case, Singapore is a 5, right? But there are business models where what you want is actually a less mature consumer. So I think overall, that's how we see the region, and I think we're out of time, so I'll leave it at this, and I think we'll have some more questions then.
I actually got quick. In a few minutes, I will open, the mic for Q&As. So if anybody has any questions, so feel free to go to the microphone. But a quick question to you, Michael: when you and your co-founders are, establishing your business in Thailand, what are the strengths and challenges to work with Thai restaurants? Because in Thai restaurants, as you know, I think there are so many restaurants, many different prices, and different qualities. How would you find out that the Thai how to find out about the consumer behaviors that actually happen to really like this this restaurant, the types of food that they like?
Okay, couple of things here. I mean, obviously we deal with consumers and we'll deal with merchants. So, and they behave separately, right? I mean, the issues that Thai restaurants have are very, very similar to the issues that Singaporean or Malaysian or Filipino restaurants have, right? They deal with fixed cost that they incur anyhow, like rents and overheads, and low capacity utilization hurts them because empty table have a profitability of 0, and we offer them to replace an inventory in distress with 0% profitability with an inventory that has now a positive profitability. So for us, while the Thai merchants are not very risk friendly, they're quite risk averse, they have the same pain points as in other countries, so we didn't feel that it was particularly challenging to sign up Thai restaurants. Now from the user behavior, it's a little bit different, right? Thai users don't like to put a lot of information online. They don't want to put credit card information online. They don't trust what happens with their information. Very different from Singapore, for example. That's why we decided not to monetize on the user end, but to monetize on the merchant end. So for the user, everything is free, and you don't have to put all of this information there. We also made some other concessions on, Thai-specific behavior. You see, we're in Singapore, we're in Thailand, and Singaporeans and Thai consumers process information very, very differently. Not at all the same way. Like Singaporeans are very cerebral. They search. They say, show me French restaurants next Wednesday, 8 o'clock, minimum 30% discount, and no less than a 4-star rating. Thais don't operate like this. Thais don't search, they hate to fill out forms. The Thai culture of consuming information is a browsing culture. So for Thai users, we created a system of panels where they can explore. They can browse locations, they can browse cuisines, they can browse different thematic panels. For example, like fine dining or a romantic dinner, etc. And we found that we created a UI UX that allows the both extremes, from people who have a browsing culture to people who have a searching culture, to all use the platform. And for us, the Thai users are on one side of the extreme, and the Singaporean users are on the other side of the extreme, and all the other countries kind of like fall somewhere in between. Malaysian users, very similar to Thai users in that respect.
All right, so if you have any questions, just feel free to go to the microphone. Yeah.
Hi, name is Don Samban, director with Disruptive Asia in Hong Kong. Love the presentation, and I love how the panel always seems to burst out into a little giggle when everyone says, leave us alone. That's, couldn't agree more. About, 10 years ago, I remember doing some interviews when I was back at the Bangkok Post with some startups at Software Park, and talking about BOI privileges. back then, no one was, I mean, in order to get BOI, you needed to invest new money every so-and-so years, and new money meant investment. Investment back then didn't mean payroll, because payroll was payroll, which meant that every year people just had to buy new computers whether they liked it or not. Have things actually become better? Follow-up on that is, if you look at the industrial parks in Ayutthaya, you've got all these factories with the machines which basically after 10 years they have to be exported whether they're obsolete or not. So basically the BOI system is subsidizing all these new industrial parks with second-hand Thai machines in Vietnam and in Myanmar, because accounting-wise you cannot have a single production line with both BOI approved and sort of BOI expired machines, which doesn't make any sense. So that's one question. I just sort of, how has the BOI help improved over the last decade or so? Second question, what are your thoughts about last week's comment about from the Finance Ministry about drafting a law for Article 44 to help startups? I think the idea that you need to draft a law to help startups is kind of counterintuitive, because get out of the way is probably better than defining it in law. So I wonder if you heard that comment and what are your thoughts? And the Digital Park Thailand lower income tax, is that helping? I mean, you touched on it, one of you touched on it, but just wondering the rest of the panel. Promises of unlimited bandwidth, low income tax. Oh, and last thought, comment. Whether you agree with the junta or not, I know companies who have had to move out of Thailand to Singapore because their customers fear data privacy. Case in point is the Cybersecurity Act and sort of the backdoor for telcos. One company, one of Thailand's biggest indigenous telco service providers, well, not sort of, well, providers to the telco industry, has had to shut down operations here on paper, move to Singapore because their clients in India did not trust data to be in Thailand. Is that a problem? So a load of questions, but I wonder if you could just touch on them, and I'll see what I can grab from your answers. Thank you very much.
I guess maybe I'll start with the BOI question. BOI was intended for to help traditional industries, basically mostly the Japanese auto manufacturers. So they gave land use rights, brakes on imported machinery. Most of the benefits of BOI grants does not help startups or even companies in the service industry. Only up to a few years ago did they even look at software companies and grant BOI approvals for software companies. And so up to a few years ago, that wasn't even, it had nothing to do with the startup world. The only benefits that the BOI gives to startups, and they could be big, is one is you don't have to worry about the 4 Thai per 1 work permit sponsor rule. And so that's an important help. It gives 3 to 7 year tax holidays. And again, for a later stage company, let's say like Mike's, or people have gotten actually to Series A, Series B stages, that's really good because they actually have taxable income. But most startups, for most of their life cycle, they're pre-revenue or are not profitable. So at the beginning, it really doesn't help too much. The third thing that is actually one of the best things is that if you're a foreign investor that wants to invest in a Thai startup, through BOI you can own 100% of that Thai registered startup, and that's actually what's been used the most in the startup community recently for BOI. But other than those 3 things, BOI doesn't really offer anything else. But BOI, when you have BOI, there's costs associated with it. So there's a lot of lawyers that actually want to go around and promote to startups, oh, do BOI, and they tell you the benefits, but they also don't tell you the costs. Every 3 months you have to do reporting and all this other stuff. And as an early stage startup, that might be too much. Plus, with BOI, you are restricted as far as what you can do. You can operate. So if you're a startup, you're going to have to do pivots. If you're a BOI company, you're kind of restricted in that sense too. So BOI has a few benefits, but sometimes the cost, the impediments it can bring can outweigh it. So that's on the BOI thing. You talk about the software park. I'll get into that. So the software park, I talked about in my third book when I talk about the history of developing the startup community. And software park, which is under NSDDA, for many years they had the wrong KPIs. They look at the success of the startup teams that graduated, and actually Software Park has been successful in creating very good entrepreneurs. No startup teams that graduate from Software Park continue to become successful. However, they've created a lot of entrepreneurs that will later go on to found successful companies. And this is, when you look at public incubators, this is how they should really be judged on. So if you look at the metrics that they should be judged on, Software Park has actually been had a positive impact in this. But if you look at the KPIs, I remember 5 years ago I started working advising at Software Park, and I looked at the KPIs and I actually challenged them. I said, according to your KPIs, if Facebook graduated from your Software Park, they would be considered a failure according to your KPIs because they didn't have X amount of employees. They exited way, the founders exited way too soon. They're not there anymore. I mean, you look at the KPIs, it didn't make any sense. It was just a completely wrong metrics to how to judge companies. But they've turned full tilt. So at the beginning of 2014, Charles Treventa became the head of Software Park. And what's good about him is he worked for Reuters. He actually worked under my friend Ben for a while, who is a good friend of mine that I've known for 20 years, who started his company Proteus. And so he was actually one of the few Thais. He was one of our Thai sponsors for the IT Startup Association. So he really understood. He was part of the startup community. He really understood the needs of startups. He knew lean and agile, the processes. So when he became head, a lot of things have changed once he became head. So before, when I first went there, before Charles was there, they were teaching the entrepreneurs there business plans, how to write 30-page business plans, and doing things like, okay, for the business model, show your returns to your shareholders as dividend payouts. I mean, it was just totally antiquated. And so, but since then, it's turned full tilt where now there's lean and agile shops, and there's the workshops, and the whole program has really changed, and so it's actually made a positive impact. I think the next one is on digital parks.
I think the other two questions,
okay.
I would like them to answer because I'm also very quite interested to hear, because as we all know in the FCCT, we've been criticizing about the Article 44 a lot, especially when it comes to the human rights. But if it's actually really helping the startups, ecosystem to use that shortcut, to use that executive order to actually help their startups, and also, any other policy that's come from the executive orders that to give a shortcut to the startups, do you think does it really help or hurt their startups, or is it going to help the startups, Thai startups, in the long terms? I would like Bart and Michael answer these questions.
Can you explain again Article 44? Just before you do that, BOI, I'd like to mention something because I completely agree with David on BOI, but I think that these three benefits are very important actually. Imagine you want to found a startup with 3 foreigners. If you're not BOI, you need to hire 12 Thai staff, right? You have a startup with 3 foreigners. You need to have 12 Thai staff from the start. And you own only 49% of your startup. Basically, you're never going to get funded. So basically, I would say that in Thailand, you cannot start a startup. You cannot found a startup right now if your company is not BOI approved.
I think for the Article 44, tell me if I'm wrong. I think it means that the government, they can give the executive order to not to be voted by the Bank of Thailand to grant the investments to the startups without
It was a comment I think by the finance minister, permanent secretary. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah.
That they would they are in the process of drafting a letter basically for the Prime Minister to sign Article 44 in order to make it easier. And they cited Uber as an example because apparently you cannot use a ride-hailing app for Uber. And they were, so that was, it was a throwaway comment, but it was an interesting one that the Ministry of Finance is actually in the process of writing to the Prime Minister to ask them to use 44.
Yeah. So basically, actually use the executive order to ease the regulation for the startups. Do you think is it going to help the startups in the long terms?
I think Michael will tell you, get out of the way.
Yeah, but I think it's the government is trying to make it get out of the way. But do you think is it? But do you think is it? I mean, you know, talking about is it ethically correct or is it, you know, what do you think? And as a business owner,
as a business, I think it's neither up to me to judge this, nor is it in my interest to judge this. See, as a company, I mean, whether a country operates in a traditional parliamentary democracy or into any other system is of secondary importance. I judge as a startup the policy output. Now, they might arrive to this policy via Article 44 or any other means. But for me, as a company, as a business, what's important is the policy output. And if that policy output, we'll see it. We'll see what it comes up with, right? For now, you know, do we need this? I don't know, right? Do I need to judge this? Absolutely not. I'll judge it when I see the policy output, and I'll tell you whether I like the output, where I think it's, you know, helpful for a startup or not. So in the end, you know, I think it's another forum that needs to discuss the level of how appropriate is that tool to be used. But for me, that's just not relevant, right? I will judge when we see what policies come out of there, if they're, you know, helpful to startups or they're not helpful to startups.
But once again, to take my example of Singapore, I think it's important to delegate the decision to the right people, right? We cannot all be experts in everything. There are people that are experts in things, and I think they should be the people taking the decision at their level. And I think that's what's very important for any form of authority, is to be able to delegate stuff.
Right. Does that answer your questions? Okay, all right. I would like the next gentleman to ask the question, please.
Hello. First of all, I thank you very much for this evening. I have one question and one comment to one of the questions this gentleman asked. My name is Jeff Blatt. I run the technology, media, and telecom group at Tillich & Gibbons. Professionally, I grew up in the Silicon Valley. I represented a lot of startups before I moved to Asia. So my question relates to exit strategies. And one of the issues that I have seen in the region, I've done a lot of work in Malaysia as well as Thailand over the last 17 years, relates to, you know, in the US it would be quite simple in a sense. You'd have many more options. You would have going public, you would have staying private, you would have getting bought by another company. What are your thoughts regarding exit strategies for startups in Thailand and in the region generally?
I think that really depends on the startup, right? I mean, look, for example, we took in a lot of our capital from strategic players, right? So obviously any strategic player who invests significantly into a startup does this with the hope of a path to ownership, right? So for us, does this chart a possible exit? Yes. Does it force us on that exit route? By no means, right? So I can only answer for myself in that sense, where I say, like, we haven't made up our mind on the favored exit route. I mean, clearly with our investors, you know, a trade sale is a clear option. It's on the table. But, you know, you're on the tiger, you're riding the tiger, and as long as it's fun to ride the tiger, why get off? Right? So for me, I'm starting to get approached by a variety of stock exchanges on possible listings. It's too early for that, right? I don't want to, you know, lock myself in at this stage. But, you know, we can't rule out a potential IPO at one point. So I would say, you know, I just believe that a lot of startups exit too late in Asia. Right? Not too early. Like sometimes the problem, they exit too early, but you see a company like Grab, right? And now they've raised $1 billion. And what people forget sometimes is that there is now $1 billion in liquidity preference sitting above Anthony Tan, right? And we've seen with Flipkart and Snapdeal in India how quickly those valuations, they are paper valuations, right? They're in startup world valuations what people are willing to pay for you, and it's as simple as that. And then your big investor comes like HSBC and marks to market, and boom, and you go from unicorn to no unicorn. So what if that were to happen to Grab, right? What if they drop in valuation to 700 million only? Then he exits with nothing, with zip all, right? So I think we've seen a lot of, from a founder perspective, as a founder, right? There's probably, unless you go absolute mega IPO, right? Like a Snap, something like this, you have to really start thinking at one point. That's something that I'm starting to think about. When is the right point to do that? Maybe, $200-300 million valuation is a much better time at your startup life as a founder to maximize your return to get out than $1 billion, right? I mean, what you're in for? You want to say I'm a unicorn, right? For me, that's not an aspiration, right? My aspiration is I have put my own money in the startup. We bootstrapped for a long time, right? So I have a very clear idea of a ROI that I like to see, right? So I think really founders need to make these calls for themselves. And I think if anything, what we've seen in Asia is people exiting, I think, too late.
Okay, that's useful.
So 97% of exits for startups throughout the world is M&A. It's not IPO. And so, and I always advise startups that you have an exit strategy in mind once you get going. Who would, and that comes down to who would buy me? Am I creating strategic value for somebody? But you don't get that confused with the fact that as a startup, you have to solve a problem first. And then the exit comes that if I solve this problem, what is my value? Now, and as far as from a straight financial sense, the timing is really important. So actually in my first book, I actually drew a simple graph of how you know. So valuation from a financial perspective is the PE ratio, which earlier in your startup, you have a greater growth prospect, so it's a high PE ratio, and then your actual revenues, if it's a revenue-based thing.
Yeah, I
and
mean,
so you want to actually, the optimal place you want to sell is when the multiple, that PE times that revenue, is at its greatest. And so what happens is if somebody exits too late, what happens is they get to that curve where they flatten out, and so their growth isn't so much, so the PE goes down, but the revenue isn't going up as much. So there's actually, from a financial, just a purely financial perspective, there's a point where you need to go ahead and sell. Another thing about exits as well is, I'll use the example of Pagemoto, which was one of the early startups, one of the first startups to exit here in Thailand that was foreign founded. Pagemoto created a site, created a platform for businesses to create Facebook business pages on Facebook. And so they decided, they actually exited earlier than they want to, but they made a decision that because of the new privacy rules and stuff coming up on Facebook, that it'd be better to exit now because they would be dependent and totally beholden on Facebook. And so they decided to exit. So there's a lot of different, things to consider when you look at an exit. But for sure, as a startup, you have to have an exit strategy in mind. But not be so set it in stone, because you're going to be doing pivots, the market conditions change and stuff like that. But you have to have that guidance because investors are going to want to see that exit too. And that's when I talked about Software Park earlier. That's what happened. Investors don't want to look at dividends. They're not. If they want to get 10% return, they're just going to invest in an RET in a stock market. They don't want that. They're looking for exponential return. So it's you really need to know your exit strategy once right at the beginning.
Okay. Do you, I would like to have the other gentlemen to have the questions. Okay.
My name is Bob Fox, Joint Foreign Chambers Digital Economy Group. My question is about innovation. When we look at this Thailand 4.0 vision, The idea is to bring innovation really at 3 levels. One of them is a whole economy level, and then at an industry level, then at the firm level. And when we talk about that, we have to talk about transformation and change in the way we all do things. What is the impact then on startups in innovation? And let me illustrate. So innovations, and some of them we've heard of today, are game changers in the way we do things generally. And those changes can infuse into what we do in our companies. They can infuse into what happens in an industry or an economy-wide. If we apply that to SMEs, they may take in those changes and use the output. They're not going to buy the startup. A larger company may buy the startup. Governments typically want to do it themselves. Bart talked about how there is a kind of, I don't want to bastardize your words, but you nicely described how a lessening of the number of startups was possibly having an impact on lessening innovation, if I may put it like that. There used to be a nice idea about industry concentration ratios. So if you're an antitrust committee, you might be deciding whether to approve a merger or not, and you looked at the impact on lessening competition in the market. So my analogy is a little bit similar, perhaps. But I'm just wondering the panel's views on how do startups work in bringing innovation in those 3 levels in practice? Are there faster ways to bring innovation by forcing, for example, SMEs to do transformation and funding them to make changes?
Right. I have to give you guys only 30 seconds for each of you to answer these questions because we're running out of time.
Okay, so as far as, so the best way for SMEs to innovate in Thailand is to engage with startups, whether it's a partnership or acquisition. And so we have it so that right now you have some government agencies that are saying, well, they have their own constituencies. They have like software development companies that work with existing SMEs and help them patch up their existing legacy systems. And that's really a nominal improvement in their efficiency. Whereas really that same agency should really be turning around and saying, look, let's work with startups that maybe have more cloud-based solutions, and be willing to replace those legacy systems and those and that to use the cloud-based system. That also entails training and changing the culture a little bit within those traditional companies, the SMEs. So that's just my take on that.
I think
30 seconds.
Innovation, if you want innovation, you have to fund innovation. It's as simple as that. And that's not just a problem in Thailand, that's a problem in Singapore. We, as an innovative company, a lot of my disillusion with Singaporean VCs comes from Singaporean VCs that are only willing to fund stuff where you can show them how everything will behave based on experience that has already been made somewhere. I haven't come to the the full bottom of it. Is the price of failure so high in Singapore that it's disincentivized? What's the issue? But in Thailand, Singapore, it's a very similar situation. If you want innovation, you gotta fund it. So I think that's where government actually might be able to help, where the VCs and the private equity is scared to fund innovation. Maybe there, government funds can come in handy.
I think we've seen in the US, right, that innovation comes from immigration. Donald Trump doesn't like that, right? He will probably call it fake news. But if you look at the startups that are founded in the US, between the different periods, 40 to 50% are funded by immigrants. You can name big ones, right? Like Google, with one co-founder that's a foreigner. So I think the Asian market right now need more influx from and input from immigration, from foreigners. It's not that the foreigners are doing it best. It's just that they're doing it differently and they're bringing a new way of thinking. So every country, every ecosystem need to mix people. And I think that's what's important now in Asia, in Southeast Asia and in Thailand, is to start opening. Now they have the value, they have the pay, they have the platform. Now start opening and start the question about exit was also the exit strategy, right? So far, the only idea was to be bought. Lazada was built to be bought by Amazon. That was clear from the beginning. That didn't happen, but that was Alibaba, so it was not that far. Now they need to move away from that. Now they need to come with companies that are not built to be bought by the foreign countries, but that are built to conquer the world, right? And to do that, you need a mix of people from different regions, I think.
All right, okay, we only have time for one last question, and I want the answer to be really, really, really short, okay? I'm a journalist. I like clean and clear sentence. One sentence, 10 seconds. Okay, all right.
Yep.
Martin Mensky Stalling. I'm from Chiang Mai, and I'm working with the regional Chiang Mai ecosystem and also with the universities, science parks and incubators at universities. Whilst I'm at the universities, I'm always wondering, isn't the startup discourse in Thailand too focused on youth and young people? If you it seems to be like you're saying it's a foreigners who could bring in additional experience. I'm wondering if there doesn't have to be some way of unlocking older ties to also startups, go into startups, not just young people, because they have skills in different verticals, they have problem-solving skills. How can we nurture a culture where it's not just about young entrepreneurs doing relatively replicable business models, but people with really deep experience? You know, it's a saying that actually the best startups are run by people over 35 or 40 rather than young people. So could you comment a little bit on, it seems to be an age phenomenon at the moment, and the minister now was saying young people. That's great, I like it, but.
Okay, can I take this? Go first. I give you something short on this because I was 40 when I founded Itigo, right? And I didn't put that slide up today, but I have a slide that speaks about the experience and opportunity cost conundrum of entrepreneurs. And that's exactly what you said. See, like, it's always the wrong time to found a startup, because if you're young, you have a very low opportunity cost, right? But you don't know anything, right? And when you're older, you have a lot of experience, but your opportunity cost to put 4 years of your life. You say, I was 40, I married 2 children, expensive wife, an expensive school, right? And for 2 years, you can't pay yourself. How many people will do that, right? Not a lot. Would the startup ecosystem and innovation, everything improve when you get this? For sure, right? But we are stuck in this, you know, experience opportunity cost conundrum. And just like it takes, you know, bold, irresponsible young men to found companies like Uber, and afterwards we're all surprised why they are led by bold, irresponsible young men, because they were founded by because you need to be irresponsible because they're young and they have a low opportunity cost, but they don't know anything, but they still try. Now, when you come to the older people, right, of course they have the higher opportunity cost, so maybe for them to be irresponsible and make that jump is, the hurdle is just higher, right?
Yeah, I heard it from a famous VC, I can't remember which one, but someone came to him and was explaining, because he was in Michael's situation, I would like to found a startup, but I cannot afford to bootstrap, to live on pastas, and to not spend money, and the VC told him, then startups is not for you, right? If Snapchat is Snapchat, if Snapchat was able to become a multi-billion company, it's because the founders are people that were living at their parents and could not pay themselves for 3 years. If you cannot do that, then think again before you start a startup that will be bootstrapped for years. Unfortunately, that's the problem, and it's a difficult one to solve.
So tonight we actually been talking a lot about, you know, the policies, about, you know, about the financial sectors, about, you know, how the politics involved in this. But, you know, one last thing that I would like, you know, each of you to tell me, only 10 seconds, one sentence, very, very quick. What would you like to tell the Thai startups? You know, what would you like to see in the futures of the Thai startups if they want to grow to the you know, to the bigger level, to the international level? What would be your advice to them? Just one sentence.
My advice to Thai startups is to think beyond Thailand. There's a really big difference between startups here that are based in Thailand that are founded by foreigners and one founded by Thais. It's very inward looking where startups founded by Thais are looking at just the Thai market. And so they've limited their scope, and investors, Thailand's not a big enough market where you're going to have a unicorn by just doing stuff just in Thailand. If you want to get Series B and later money, you have to have a regional growth strategy. The foreign founders, they come in, and they're not thinking of, they're looking at Thailand as a base. You know, I think Mike's a perfect example, but he's not the only one. So this is a base to have a regional growth strategy. And looking at the fundings, if you look at all this, there was a dozen Series A and later fundings last year. 9 of those 12 were foreign founders.
You're running out of your one sentence. So. Sorry, have to cut you off. Like Michael?
Yeah, I think, you know, but I tend to agree. So I think we don't want to see necessarily more from Thai startups, but from Thai entrepreneurs. And that doesn't necessarily mean to focus on Thailand. It might be Thailand, it might be anywhere else, right? But what I want to see is I want to see more Thai entrepreneurs, and that's why I think e-commerce is a great example, by the way, right? And I think what they need to do is just, you know, don't see what is, see what can be, right?
Bart?
Yes, I agree with both of them, so that would be short. See yourself as an entrepreneur in Thailand and not as a Thai entrepreneur. That's what's important for everyone.
Actually, there's one startup called Prisa that was a Thai-founded startup, and their first market was Indonesia. They didn't even start in Thailand. They started in Indonesia. And so this is kind of like, you know, you're just not limiting yourself to Thailand. So we need more of those. We need more of those startups.
All right. Thank you very much, gentlemen. Thank you very much for coming. Thank you.
Thank you.